hello there. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek Show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, and with me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. Say hey, Brian.
What's going on, Dre? Yeah, man, big night in the NBA. Bucks are playing the Mavericks. Luka is hurt, but still, a lot of great games going on.
So is Bledsoe, I believe, which we will get into.
Yeah.
If you're at a basketball podcast, Luka Doncic and Eric Bledsoe are two names you are familiar with. Anyway, we're actually doing a back-to-back podcast, Brian, finally. So we are back, and we're going to be talking. I had like a weird overarching idea that I kind of wanted to talk about, so we'll give that a try. Then we're just going to talk some MVP scenarios that I was thinking about this week that I had a lot of fun with, and then we're going to talk some of our favorite teams, including your Warriors, Brian. Hopefully it's not as bad as I think it is.
No, it's just, the thing about the Warriors is here's what we were saying for a long time during their good run, right, where they won all those titles in the last 5 years or so. The results have been great, but we hear rumors in the media about their process and we're not sure. And then we get to this year and everything breaks down. We're like, aha, that's it. Well, there's another bad process rumor about the Warriors that came out today that we will talk about.
Oh, yeah, for sure. All right. Well, anyway, before we get going, I'm going to get going with our sponsor, then talk about comments on the last couple of shows, and then we'll proceed. Anyway, if you don't know, we do have a sponsor of this show, dailyroto.com. If you use promo code NERDNUMBERS, you can get 10% off at dailyroto.com, which for those that don't know is the tool you need for everything daily fantasy sports related. Football may be almost over, but NBA is in full swing. So daily fantasy sports, dailyroto.com, promo code NERDNUMBERS. All right, on with the show. Now, all I was going to say is I didn't actually put up show notes for last week's show with Chris Ye, which I feel a little bad about, but I preferred getting just, the actual audio and stuff out. And trying to just see if there were any other comments that I wanted to chook over, because actually the 2 week ago show got some on. But I think no. I don't think we have any comments that I want to say over last week's show. I apologize for this placeholder, Brian, which was kind of a lie.
There's a lot of lying going on in 2019, so we'll forgive this one for now.
We can just say, if you haven't listened to last week's show with Chris Ye, obviously subscribe on iTunes. That's where you can see it. Of course, the YouTube channel has it as well. And then, Twitch keeps it around for a while, too. Chris Ye is just one of the best, if not the best, Lakers fans from kind of an all walks of life, right? The rumor mill on, behind the scenes drama, the actual stats and numbers, the historical, we were all over the place last week. So if you're a Lakers fan and you haven't listened to last week's show, do yourself a favor and listen.
Can I compliment Chris as well? This is one of our behind the scenes thing. We were chatting the other day about, things about the show. And it's just, man, I cannot believe how good of a broadcaster Chris is. Every time he comes on, he really shows me stuff, and he does a great job.
Yeah, and then, of course, we talked a little bit with him as well. So there's the Gray Matter podcast, which is on hiatus, but we got some, news that hopefully that'll be back in the near future. And then also he's done the Chris Ye podcast, which I believe is just on hiatus because he's traveling so much. We talked some of that last week. But if you haven't listened through the archives there, it's worth your while. And unlike the Boxscore Geek show, most of his episodes are, 5 to 20 minutes, somewhere in there. So it's really, really easy to go over.
Yeah, I've listened to all those Gray Matter podcasts, and it's him and Reed Hoffman, another very good broadcaster, has a very soothing voice, and of course he's done a few other things too, but, I've listened to the important stuff about the podcast.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, let's get on with my premise, and I want to go just hyper geeky, but I'm going to do my best to relate this to the NBA. Something we're a huge fan of on this show is chess, and so I was going to talk about the 1972 World Championship between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. And the reason this came up is I would argue this is an example in sports history of a player doing something that was amazingly beneficial for the sport, but was really, really bad for the player themselves. And the player I'm talking about is Boris Spassky, who was the world champion in 1972. He was defending against Bobby Fischer. Unlike other sports, chess is one that is much more clear-cut. There is a rating system we've talked about in chess called the ELO system, which every time you play another chess player updates. And so if a couple of players have played over time, in theory, it gives you a very crystal clear insight into the strength between the two players. As an example, it was last year, the World Championship between Fabiano Caruana and Magnus Carlsen, the top two players in the world, they were basically tied on rating, and shocker, they drew all 12 games they played for the actual championship before they went to overtime. And in overtime, they played a faster variant of chess where Magnus Carlsen, his rating is much better than Fabiano Caruana's, and then exactly what the rating said happened. It was actually very amusing to watch because we were having a scenario very much like classic sports, very much like, basketball and the narratives of, oh, is playoff LeBron James here? Oh, is Kevin Durant's mindset there, right? All of this stuff. And it basically played out exactly like the numbers said, because in chess, it's much more clear cut. All of these external factors we want to believe can change things are much more minimized in chess.
Yeah. So when you look at all the different games and sports out there, right, there's different amounts of randomness and there's different amounts of time that players and teams can beat each other, right? So you look at something like poker, where randomness is just literally in the rules of the game, right? You have random cards coming out. And then even sports like football or, NFL or NBA, right? There's things like turnovers, players can it doesn't seem random, but we know from looking at the numbers that it is, right? Some good teams just have bad shooting nights. But then you have things like chess, things like tennis. We were talking about Federer a little bit before the show. There's almost no randomness and variation at all. The best player is going to win almost every time in those sports and games.
Yeah, because Matt, what happened in the World Championship? I'll recap this little. In the last game, basically it could either go to overtime or Magnus could play for a win. Magnus opted to just go for a draw, even though the numbers probably said he was drawing, but they also said he had a chance. So the metaphor we brought up with this was kind of like, you could go for it on fourth down in the fourth quarter or go to overtime. The difference being it would almost be like going to overtime knowing you're going to win the coin toss. And in the old school days of football, winning the coin toss was like 60% of the time you were guaranteed to win. I believe the numbers said that Magnus was like 80% to win in the format he was going to play Caruana in overtime. And so after he did that, after he proposed a draw, people were like, oh, has Magnus lost his edge? Oh, is Magnus in his own head? Chess pundits were coming out saying, "Oh, I don't think he's gonna do as well in this overtime as people think." And he just came out and beat the crap out of Fabiano, who, Fabiano is great, but it's just like, the numbers are like, oh, if you two play chess with this time control, Magnus Carlsen's supposed to just destroy you, which is what happened. Whereas, you just mentioned that in sports like football or even basketball, a team can be like a 2-1 favorite or something, and just random circumstances. The right player gets injured, the wrong player gets injured.
Yeah.
Flips the game.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, with that in mind, we go back to the 1972 chess championship. The reason I brought up this perfect rating system is Bobby Fischer was a significantly better player than Boris Spassky, according to the numbers. And Bobby Fischer had an historic run to get to the World Championship. I believe he had like 19 straight wins in chess. Right now in basketball, we are applauding the Bucks, who I believe are probably going to win their 19th straight tonight, as an amazing accomplishment. And there are some people that are like, oh, they played some weak competition or whatever. It's like, winning 19 straight games in a sport like basketball, even if they played the Knicks 19 straight times, winning 19 straight times is impressive, because we were just saying that, right? I think in basketball, the odds are probably something like 4-1, I would estimate, between the best and worst team in the NBA, or at least playoff wise, right? Like the best playoff team versus the worst playoff team probably is a 4-1 favorite. So winning 19 straight is still very impressive. Bobby Fischer was playing the top chess players in the world, which is what you have to do to get to the World Championship. That's a funny thing we've noted about chess before is, despite having the most perfect rating system, they have the most stupid playoff system for deciding the World Championship. That was the impressive part about last year's championship between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, is the number 1 and number 2 player were playing, which is what's supposed to happen, but it normally doesn't because their system is really screwed up. But so Bobby Fischer, an amazingly better player than Boris Spassky, crushes his competition en route to the finals. The sad thing for people that know chess is Bobby Fischer had a lot of mental issues, a lot of off-the-court drama, and was unfortunately just not in I'm not talking like chess playing state. He was not in a very good mental state to just go to the chess championship. And by that, I mean just like even show up for the game. That was that he was having issues with that. He didn't want cameras. He thought the camera noise was too loud. There are some people that have speculated after the fact that they think he might have had a condition like a hypersensitivity kind of thing, where things like colors and noises, etc., did actually impact him. And I mean, that might have to do with why he was so good at chess. But but just pointing out, he had lots of issues unrelated to chess that made it very hard for him to compete. And what actually happened after he won the 1972 championship is he just kind of refused to ever play again, kind of became a recluse, lots of off the court stuff that was unfortunately sad, really went off the rails. But this 1972 championship that he won was huge for the game of chess because it brought mainstream attention, namely American attention, to it. But what happened, if you don't know the 1972 World Championship, is Bobby Fischer messed up in the first game. He tried to, something Bobby Fischer was known for is he didn't like going for draws. He'd always go for a win. So in game one, it looked like it was a draw, and he got aggressive at the end and tried to go for a win and lost the first game. And everybody was like, oh my goodness, exact same BS we're saying. But, he, in theory, he should be fine. In game two, he refused to show up because he was complaining about the conditions, and they actually forfeited him. He came back for game three and was still complaining about the conditions, and he asked to play in a back room. And Boris Spassky lamented and said, okay. So they were playing a best of 24. Boris Spassky is up 2-0. Bobby Fischer is a much superior player, but what's happening is he is just really complaining, and they're in a situation where it looks like what's probably going to happen is Bobby Fischer is just going to forfeit. He's going to complain too much. They're going to say, we're not going to put up with your demands. The way chess tournaments used to work in the 70s, I don't know as much now. I need to look into it. But the way they used to work is a country, very much like the Olympics, would put up a bid to have the championship there. And then they would offer a prize pool to the players. And then in exchange, they got like the television rights, etc. So Iceland won the bid to have the championship game, and they were televising it. And so Bobby Fischer was saying, I don't want it to be televised. I don't want it to be in front of an audience. And Iceland's going, we gave you all of this money, and we're charging admission, and we're trying to do the television rights. And you're saying you don't want to play in front of spectators, and you don't want it broadcast. What are you talking about? And so Spassky would have been very much in his rights to say, play in the conditions we both agreed to play, because they both championship players have to agree where they wanted the match held. He could have said, we both agreed to this, you play. If you don't play, I just retain my title. But Spassky actually lamented, and then Bobby Fischer beat the crap out of him. Bobby Fischer got into his element and just won. And there's a fantastically hilarious drunk history on this, where they recount what happened, which is, if you haven't listened before,
it's a really good show.
Look up drunk history Bobby Fischer. It's really funny. And then I've watched several documentaries on it. But the reason this popped into my head is, had Boris Spassky done what I just suggested, right? Said, play the game we agreed to, he retains the title. What probably happens is Boris Spassky probably loses the next title match. Because for those that don't know, that the next world champion was Anatoly Karpov, who was one of the greatest chess champions ever. And the player that he was a huge competitor with was Garry Kasparov, who is also one of, if you basically look at the World Chess Championship contemporary, you could basically take your pick, Brian. One of Garry Kasparov or Karpov is the Kevin Durant Warriors. And one of them is, the Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen Bulls. Take your
What do you
pick.
mean, Dre? Kevin Durant never played for the Warriors. I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, well, and
we'll have to explain that later. I
think this actually kind of applies because Kasparov and Karpov both played for the Soviet Union, and there was lots of behind the scenes politicking with being a professional athlete under Soviet Russia. And how they treated you if you did well versus not. So
and they were dominant at chess too, the Soviet Union. Spassky was also Soviet, of course.
And but the issue is being like, when a player like Spassky would lose, the Soviet Union would treat them terribly behind the scenes.
Right.
So it's very much like Kevin Durant. I'm sure Kevin Durant appreciates that. But my big point being, Spassky was right in front of this, you could call it like a Russian wave of amazing players that, we're going to dominate chess for the next 2-3 decades. So it's not as if him getting beaten. It's not as if him beating Bobby Fischer in that world championship would have prevented what was already coming. It's not as if he changed the landscape of chess, at least in terms of the players that were dominant. But what he did do, like I said, is the United States, Bobby Fischer was everywhere. He was one of the biggest names in the 70s, which brought a lot of mainstream attention to chess, which got it a much bigger field. In fact, a lot of his quote unquote outrageous demands improved the quality of chess for future players to make more and more money. So Spassky doing this helped the game of chess tremendously, but he gave up a title to do so. And you can't even really make the argument that had he kept the title, he would have stopped the upcoming future great chess players from becoming great. All he really did was make the game better, but sacrifice himself. And the metaphor I came up with is, imagine if during it's 2016, right? The 3-1 Warriors that lost to the Cavaliers.
16-17, I think. Or no, you're right. 15-16, right? Yeah. 2016
NBA Finals. The Golden State Warriors are the most dominant team in NBA history. They've won 73 games. They are up 3-1 in the finals against LeBron James, and they don't look like they have a prayer. And then the following things happen. Andrew Bogut gets injured. Draymond Green gets suspended, and Steph Curry has been dealing with the nagging injury from slipping on Sweat. I think he slipped on Sweat in one of the matches and then injured his leg or knee again in another.
Yeah, so, against the Rockets, it was Monty Eunice on the Rockets who fell behind him.
So Steph Curry isn't 100%. Andrew Bogut is out. Draymond Green is suspended. And all of this happens for a perfect confluence of events for the Cavaliers to come back and win this title. And the comparable I gave is, imagine if the Warriors had came forward and said, you know what, this is supposed to be, not the Warriors, the Cavaliers had said, this Warriors team is amazing. They really deserve a chance to show how great they are. So we don't want Draymond Green suspended. And in fact, can we take a week off? Want to just take a week off and let Andrew Bogut and Steph Curry get 100%? And then we'll start over. We'll play again, and we'll even give you the 3-1. If the Cavaliers had done that, the Warriors win, no question, and that might be better for the sport. Who knows? Who knows if they go after Kevin Durant? So maybe Kevin Durant stays in OKC. Cleveland has never been a great team in terms of being a title contender. So maybe LeBron James moves on. That might have been better for the sport, but obviously it would have cost Cleveland a title. And this overarching theme of what's good for the player versus what's good for the sport is funny because we clash on it a lot, right? A lot of times we'll say it is not a good thing for the NBA, as an example. The specific example I was going to use is Anthony Davis versus Giannis Antetokounmpo, two of the best players in the NBA. It is not good for the NBA that Giannis is in Wisconsin. It's not good for him to be on the Milwaukee Bucks. But he might enjoy it better, right? The NBA has a max salary cap, so it's not as if Giannis is missing out that much salary money. And the NBA is going more global, so depending on how intelligent his marketing is, he might, still be able to recoup a lot of dollars. It might be a better scenario for him to be on the Bucks, but it is worse for the NBA. And so, like I said, this chess thing kind of just clicked in my head because I was the exact thought I had that I compared it to is I said, imagine if the 2016 Cavaliers had foregone the suspension on Draymond Green, what would have happened in NBA history? Because, I would argue that that's one of the best championships ever. That LeBron James championship, that has cemented LeBron James's legacy, right? Albeit at the cost of the most dominant team in NBA history not getting a title.
Yeah, it's funny when you're talking about that Spassky story. I was thinking about it from his perspective, right? How would I feel if I were him? And I know next to nothing about chess, but I have played in competitive tournaments, even pro tour events for other games, so I have a little bit of that mentality anyway. And like when you're there, you spend weeks and weeks preparing, and you just want to win. And someone comes in and tries to put this bullshit on you that's outside of the game and has nothing to do with the game. You're just like, come on. I mean, yeah, I would have not, I would have not done what Spassky did at all. That's ridiculous. So, but maybe you're right. Maybe he should have done it. thing I'll
I
say that. Oh, go
give,
ahead.
I give him so much respect for what he did for the game because Spassky basically said, this is the greatest player in the world. And he might not have known this at the time, but thinking maybe in one of his only chances to win a title, because there was all sorts of politicking in chess at the time. Like the Soviet Union did do lots of stuff where they would try and rig things to make it easier for their people to go to the title game. So he might have gone, this might be one of Fischer's only chances to get a title. And he's one of the best players in the game. And I came here to play. He came here to play. We should just play. That's what we're here for. All this other stuff is immaterial. And that is amazing. Like I give him full hats off for that, because the alternative is what we always strive for, right? We come on this show and we bash Carmelo Anthony and we bash Donovan Mitchell and we bash players like, historical players like Kobe Bryant and Allen Iverson. And then when we introspect on it, we go, these players are professional athletes and their goal is to get paid. Their goal is to not make a billionaire, have one more title team or have more gate revenue. So they should do what they want to. And so Boris Spassky could have had another 3 years as world champion, and he gave that up to let the greatest player in chess at the time showcase his talents.
Yeah, and who knows? You were talking about, the Soviet pressure behind the scenes. Maybe he had pressure, on him to say, you've got to go out and dominate Fischer and show how good we are. So don't let this go, Spassky. I don't know. I'm guessing, but yeah, I mean, that's my problem with it though, is that he's the one put in the tough spot to make that decision. Whereas it's Fischer who's destroying the integrity of the match, if that makes any sense, right? It shouldn't be on Spassky to make that call. It should be on the judges. So I don't know. Competitively, it's really unfair, but your point is really well taken, especially in the historical context.
Well, Fischer is such an interesting case because, as I mentioned, off the court he had lots of issues, and he eventually went full anti-Semitic.
Right.
He did all sorts of stuff. He got the United States went after him for tax evasion because he made some horrible comments after 9/11. He eventually wound up in Norway, and everyone in Norway hated him. Basically, they are Iceland, not Norway. What am I talking about? Because he won the world championship in Iceland. So Iceland eventually offered him. They said, you can come here and stay because you're a national treasure essentially. And he got there, and they're like, oh my goodness, this guy is the worst. And eventually died there. But he had complaints, and in the realm of chess, a lot of what he did was, like I said, was correct. He was arguing for better conditions, better pay, better treatment of players, et cetera, et cetera. But it's funny because you go, oh, I don't know if your complaints were valid or if that was just your personality and it happened to be right in this field.
Yeah, I guess I can't really say too much because I don't know what the conditions actually are. So let me bring up an example from yesterday. Yesterday was the finals of the Capcom Cup, right? Street Fighter 5, one of the biggest fighting games, historical, famous game. And they have this whole tour now that Capcom sponsors, all these big events. Whoever gets the most points goes to the Capcom Cup. It's like the Super Bowl of Street Fighter, right? So we come down to the end, and yesterday, and it's actually two Americans, which is amazing. Usually Japan dominates. So 2 Americans, both young guys. One was actually the #1 player, Punk, and the other, Idom, is this up-and-coming guy who's one of the biggest stories from this year in fighting games. Cut to the end of the story, Idom ends up beating Punk, which is a big upset, right? And Punk ends up saying something afterwards like, oh, my setup was a joke. There was all this lag. That's why I lost. And I don't know enough to know about the game to know if that's a valid complaint or not, but a bunch of people went into the comments and said, oh, yeah, that explains the way you played. You weren't playing like yourself at all. So what I'm getting at is there's a non-trivial point that the conditions might have cost Punk, the #1 Street Fighter player, a title, a world title. So conditions matter quite a bit. So I'm not going to totally poo-poo what Fischer did there because I don't know the full story, but knowing, like you said, his crazy anti-Semitic rants, it's hard he has a little bit less, credibility than someone like Punk to me. That's all.
Yeah, and I mean, your point about Spassky is 100% right, which is going. There's all these political underpinnings going on. Henry Kissinger actually
Ooh.
argued with Fischer to go. He basically said, on behalf of the United States, you should go. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State at the time in the 70s.
Yeah.
Horrible person since then, but the point being, the United States government got involved to the point to say, you owe it to your country to compete in this world title against the Soviets. So there's all this political stuff going on behind the scenes. Fischer is fighting about about player conditions, and Spassky is just the world champion that wants to display the game. So it's possible he had ulterior motives or they're pushing, but I do think it's one of these funny ones where on the show we a theme we have on the show is underrated greatness, right? We love players like Ben Wallace who won the Hall of Fame. And I think we give so much as a whole in terms of sports. We love winners and we love great accomplishments. And I think sometimes taking a step back and appreciating players that, just basically advance the game, sometimes at cost to themselves, is worth it. And so I think Spassky is like, there's something there, right? Like this is like an all-time move that he did that there is no metric or whatever that he's going to get credit for, right? Him allowing the 1972 World Championship to proceed is one of the greatest moves in chess history, but from a player perspective would never get any recognition.
Yeah, and the more I think about this and hear you talk, it does seem like maybe there is forces above him. He's like, well, so another thing, in addition to that, maybe he has all this pressure to play, but if he's the best and he does only care about chess, which it seems like he does, maybe just playing Fischer at all is all he cares about. Like, I just need to play Fischer. I need to play the other best player. And I can see that, with some competitors.
Yeah, and I think that Russia probably would have been content because when Fischer started winning, they started accusing him of cheating and doing stuff. I think Fischer would have been content to just rattle. I think the Soviets would have been content to rattle Fischer out of the title and just retain it
Oh,
themselves.
fair enough. Okay.
So I have no idea what forces, but it's hard to know. And there are lots of I'll shout out one other documentary. I forget what it's called, but look up ESPN 30 for 30. It's the flip side of the Miracle on Ice. So the Miracle on Ice, for those that don't know, in 1980, United States hockey team at Lake Placid defeated the Soviets for gold in hockey. It was a huge deal in United States history. People argue, it was a shifting tide in the Cold War. But if you view it as what it was like for Soviet players, some of these players wanted to come to the NHL and weren't allowed to because of their Soviet contracts. The conditions they were playing under were horrible. A funny thing I've heard about Soviet players in hockey is they did not practice slap shots because they did not have money for extra sticks, and sticks typically break on slap shots. You pull it back and basically swing the stick really hard. So they would not practice slap shots because they could not afford extra sticks. The Soviet Union did not have as much money as the United States in the Cold War. So despite the fact that they were competing at top level in all of these athletics, it's like they didn't have the money to be doing that, and yet they kept trying it. So it's funny to look at the situation for Soviet players when you look over the Cold War and the United States versus Russia and them fighting. When you look at kind of these top tier athletes and performers caught in the middle, it's a much different story. It's very fascinating to look over. So I'd highly recommend that for any history fans.
I agree. A quick correction, though. The Miracle on Ice game was the first game of the medal round, not the gold medal game. The U.S. beat Finland in the gold medal game.
And you're getting me because I've actually brought that up on the show before where Herb Brooks has this famous speech that was in the movie Miracle where he says, great moments are born from opportunity. So he does that speech before the Russia game. Who did they play in the gold medal round? It was Finland. One of the. Yeah, they played Finland in the gold. The United States team was down 2-1 going into the third period, and Herb Brooks just said, "If you don't win this, you'll take it to your fucking grave." And I've used that quote before. So
the Soviets did go on to win the silver, though. They won the consolation.
And then I think they came back and won gold the next one. So it was, and that one's just that's an interesting one to watch because the Soviets are viewed as the the favorite, which they absolutely were on paper. But to what we were just saying about chess versus other sports, there were lots of other factors, such as the seeding of the tournament, that were harder. The United States had an easier draw than the Soviets. The conditions, basically, the bunks that the Soviets played in were later turned into a prison. So where the Soviets were staying, they weren't staying in amazing hotels like the United States players. They were basically staying in a prison. So all sorts of stuff there. Thank you for letting me get 1970s Cold War sporting events, Brian, as the top of the show. Let's get on to NBA.
It's a good thing because apparently in 2019 we forgot the Cold War ever happened. So anytime you remind me of that, it's good. It's a good thing.
I was listening to a podcast where there was a Cold War expert, and someone said, the United States won the Cold. Someone said something like the United States won the Cold War. Of course, she said, I'm not so sure because
Nope.
the ex-KGB basically has an agent in the White House. So who the heck knows who won the Cold War?
The KGB literally bought the United States. Is kind of what happened.
And we'll talk about that more. Let's wait. We'll wait till Trump news simmers a little, and then don't worry, we'll talk more of that. Brian, let's drag it political talk. But I have two MVP scenarios for you, Brian. I wanted to throw by you. The first one bums me out a little because I was going to say Luka Doncic for MVP. Here's my thesis. Here's my set of conditions. If the Dallas Mavericks win more than 50 games and are a top 4 seed by the end of the season, Luka Doncic wins the MVP. I'm throwing that out there right now.
Oh, you want me to answer right away? Yes. I've seen that theory many times, and I think it's a valid one in terms of what would happen in the real world. I think people would love to vote Luka as MVP. I still would maybe say my MVP is Giannis because he's the best player in the league and he's on the best team in the league. So just because Luka has risen up so far and risen the Mavericks up so far, we don't need a great amount of curve. But yeah, I mean, I can see that logic, and I could see it happening for sure.
Although it is, I mean, I will also say this. I expected with letting Brogdon out the door, with just some aging to players like both of the Lopez twins, to even like Eric Bledsoe, I expected this Bucks team to take a step back. They're playing amazing. We didn't go huge in depth in it last week, but when we were looking over George Hill, I was laughing about this, Brian. George Hill is now winning the Kawhi Leonard trade. Those that way back in the day, it was a draft day trade. The San Antonio Spurs offered George Hill to the Indiana Pacers for the draft rights to Kawhi. So the Pacers did actually have Kawhi Leonard with the 15th pick, and they agreed. And at the time, people were like, "This is a win-win trade." The Indiana Pacers get an amazing guard, and the San Antonio Spurs get a good prospect. Win-win-win-win. And going back on it, I've said, because Kawhi turned great so quickly, it was easy to go, no, you all are fools. We all knew Kawhi was going to be great. Kawhi, very much like Luka Doncic, was a draft prospect that the advanced analytics nerds were absolutely in love with. That being said, we've said forever that there's no guarantee that a young prospect both plays well and also stays healthy. So going back in time, I actually go, that trade was a little more fair than I've given it credit for because I do post hoc rationalization. The reason it ends up being a complete loss for the Pacers, though, is they did just end up letting George Hill walk. And so this is very much the other comparable I brought this up to is the Charles Barkley trade back in the day from the 76ers. They traded for Jeff Hornacek, who was a great player, but then Jeff Hornacek leaves in the offseason. So you go, well, you traded Charles Barkley for a really good player, but then you lost that really good player, so you don't have Charles Barkley, you don't have Jeff Hornacek. Good work. So it's very much the same with the Indiana Pacers, where it's like, well, you got George Hill. They did get him for 6 years, but then it's like, then you let him walk. So it's like, had you kept Kawhi, you would have had 7+ years of Kawhi as opposed to 6 years of George Hill. So that's how you lose.
Yeah, and you're right about the Lopez brothers, but I thought Chris brought something. He changed my thinking last week on the show that, Covington has played really well all of a sudden. He wasn't great early in the year, but he's been almost as good as Brogdon and at a position that's more of a position of need for the 76ers, the Bucks. Like you said, they have George Hill playing Brogdon's position very well. So it kind of has worked out for the Bucks. Of course, Bledsoe being hurt doesn't help things that much, but if Bledsoe had been healthy, it's hard to nitpick, though. They are still, historic point margin territory right now. Anytime you're up in 10 points or more of SRS or margin of victory, That's very few teams have ever done that in history. And last time I saw, they were up 11 or 12 still. So yeah, one of the best teams of all time, which is kind of crazy to say.
Yeah, pretty much. They have no weaknesses outside of Kyle Korver, who maybe is just a veteran presence there, and the Lopez and the center.
Yeah.
And they're able to get away with the center right now. It's the same point we've kind of made about the Warriors back in the day when they didn't really have a legit center. It's like, if you have enough wing players that are versatile, you can get away without a center. So it's like, congratulations. If you have Giannis and Ersan Ilyasova and like Wes Matthews, you can get away without a center. Although the question is the exact same thing we kind of said last year. It's like, if you believe George Hill, Eric Bledsoe, Ersan Ilyasova, Dante DiVincenzo, Chris Middleton, and Pat Connaughton, if you believe they're all star level, then this team's looking in great shape. Who knows? Something that is kind of reaffirming.
Oh, did I say Covington? You know who I meant there.
Ilyasova?
No. No, Middleton. Covington is on Minnesota. I'm getting names wrong today.
And then the last kind of interesting capper on the Bucks I'll give there that is fascinating is, I will say, Coach Budenholzer does seem to be something, right? Don't forget, he was great in Atlanta. One of the things we noted is, Seth Partnow and Nylon Calculus, advanced analytics person that we've had, occasional disagreements with, we'll put it that way. He left in this offseason, but they kept Budenholzer, and Budenholzer just seems to be doing great schemes for the team. And this could just be a case of a coach really maximizing what he has.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll repeat what we said last week, is all those guys are big, right? Even if the Lopez brothers aren't great, they're at least big. Giannis obviously is. So big teams are good, and they're maximizing that.
All right. So, I would agree that Giannis is definitely the front runner. We'll have to see what this Bucks team does. I was looking this up for a friend of the show, Ty Willinghands, about the Bucks' historical performance while being a great team. So here's a fun bit of trivia, Brian. If you look at the teams, I'm going to try and look this up really quickly because I did type it out. If you look at the teams that have finished multiple seasons in NBA history with an SRS above 8, the Bucks have the worst all-time performance. And so by that, what I mean is, as an example, the Bulls had 3 seasons with an SRS above 3. They made it to the finals all 3 times, and they won all 3 titles. Because it was like 92 Bulls, the 96 Bulls, and the 97 Bulls, I believe. I think 98 they fell below it. The Spurs, I think, had it happen to them 3 times. They made it to 3 finals, or they made it to 2 finals, won the 2 finals. They missed a 3rd one, but that 3rd one that they missed, that was when Kawhi Leonard got injured in Game 1 when they were up against the Warriors. So they were actually up in Game 1. They had a winning regular season record against the Warriors. Kawhi goes down injured in Game 1. They get swept. If you think Kawhi is healthy, you could make the case that they might have beat Kawhi that game.
Oh man, all these what ifs.
Yeah, lots of fun what ifs. So anyway, but the Bucks have had 4 seasons with an SRS above 8. They have 1 title to show for it. That's with Oscar Robertson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But they're 1 for 4 making the finals, period, which is the worst hit rate of any team. So if they keep this performance up this season, if they don't come away with at least a finals and not a title, they'll be like the biggest, I'm lax to say choker, because part of the reason some of this stuff happens is injury. What happened, Giannis got injured in Game 5 on a key play, and then the Toronto Raptors came back to win that game with Giannis on the bench. They won a very slim margin. So I think if Giannis is in that game, they win, and they probably go on to win the series because it was a 7-game series. The Bucks also lost to the 86 Celtics, who were another great team above them on the list, and the 1972 again, Brian. The 1972 Lakers, who were also above them on the list. So basically, they just
Will
had
and Jerry West both, I think, on that team.
That's absurd. So yeah, and I think that 72 team had a record at a point for like most consecutive. I think they have like a 32 or 33 win streak. So basically, like 1972 was the year of Bobby Fischer and the Lakers. So go US.
There we go.
Yeah, basically timing and injury has cost the Bucks, but like this is their year. If they don't succeed this year, it's going to be rough. Although I'd love to see the Lakers take a title too.
I don't know if I'm ready to go that far, but Chris was just on the show, so I'll entertain that.
All right, second MVP scenario, Brian, that's just kind of a fun one. I think LeBron James has a chance of Aaron Burring the MVP title. So I don't think LeBron James is going to get a lot, if any, MVP votes in terms of first place. So for those that don't know, the way the MVP voting in the NBA works, repeated NBA there, is how United States voting should work, actually. Voters are given 5 votes, 5 points for first, 4 points for second, 3 points for third, etc., 1 point for fifth. And they pick 5 people that they want as their MVP. And at the end, the player with the most cumulative points wins. And so, as an example, this only happened one time. It was with, I forget the exact year. I think it was 89, Brian. And I wrote an article about this back in the day. But Magic Johnson actually won the MVP despite not winning the most first place votes. So he was another Laker that did it. And I'm arguing that LeBron James could do this because I don't think LeBron James is going to get a lot of first place votes because there are players like Giannis and Luka and Harden. But I think if the first place vote gets fractured enough, I think LeBron James is like the de facto number 2 vote. And I think for those that don't remember, Aaron Burr was Thomas Jefferson's essentially running mate, but this was before there was running mates. The first plan for the vice president of the United States was the winner was president, the runner-up was vice president, the idea being that if you had 2 people that were competing, you'd have the top 2 parties in control. And it was also more of a ceremonial thing. Vice president really didn't mean anything. So the first election actually was like George Washington and John Adams. And so they said, George Washington is president. John Adams is the person we're grooming to be the next president. So we'll let him sit around and be vice president. And then later, Aaron Burr did the same thing. He campaigned for Thomas Jefferson and said, "As thanks for campaigning and winning New York."
Because he was governor of New York.
He was not. He tried to be governor. He was a senator.
Right, he failed, but he was a New York guy, yeah.
He attempted to go for governor of New York, but Aaron Burr was a senator in New York, and he managed to, because the United States is an electoral college, meaning a state goes all to one candidate as opposed to like a fair vote. He managed to flip New York to get all of the delegates to Thomas Jefferson, which won Thomas Jefferson the election, essentially. And as thanks, he got the vice president. But the problem was vice president's supposed to be the runner-up, but everybody voted for Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And so Aaron Burr tied Thomas Jefferson and then went, oh, actually, I'm going to try and go for the president myself, even though he had agreed ahead of time he was really vice president. And I'm saying, not that insidious, but I'm saying LeBron James could be kind of the runner-up person that everybody thinks is the number 2 MVP candidate that comes away with the number 1 if there's enough fracturing amongst the number 1 candidate.
That's less insidious than what I thought you meant when you said Aaron Burring it, which is LeBron shoots Giannis in a pistol duel, like Alexander Hamilton.
No, not going that far, not getting into any musicals. But I just thought Luka Doncic and LeBron James are 2 fascinating MVP candidates because, of course, at this point, it is a 2-horse race, I think, between Harden and Giannis, potentially LeBron James, depending on how the Lakers do.
So if Doncic comes back from his injury and plays really well, you think that's not enough? The injury time keeps him out of it.
I'm saying the Mavericks will need to do really, really well.
Oh, when he's out, yeah.
They're capable of doing that. Even with him. I mean, he's playing above his head. It's nuts. And this team is okay without him, but it's like to win over 50 games in the NBA is a tough pill. And for instance, we don't think Kristaps Porzingis is that good. So to win 50 games with Kristaps Porzingis on that roster is going to be really rough. But if they do it, I think Doncic gets the award. Or I think another possibility is there's enough, like I said, enough fracturing among top candidates, and LeBron James, swoops in and gets the award with like all of the number 2 votes and like 2 number 1 votes.
One thing I'll say about the Mavericks that might help them here is they're playing Luka along with Tim Hardaway Jr., and he's not one of their best guards. Like, he's really not great at all. So guys that could come in and fill in for Luka, guys on their bench, are actually really good, like DeLon Wright, Seth Curry, and Jalen Brunson. So the Mavericks are pretty stacked at guard and could be okay for now. But, even to begin with, their record with Luka is nowhere near the Lakers or the Bucks or the top teams, and neither is their point margin, although it's still pretty good. So, I'm with you overall that Luka's chances are looking slim with the injury and the general situation.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about record, I think as an example, voters have traditionally hated giving the MVP to a team that gets a blockbuster deal. So Anthony to the Lakers, I think, could keep AD and LeBron James out. My thinking on the Bucks initially was that if they regressed at all, there was no way Giannis was going to win back-to-back awards. With how well they've started, this happened once before with the Indiana Pacers. The Indiana Pacers are a team, Patrick always goes out to Vegas every preseason, makes some bets. He bet the under on the Indiana Pacers. They basically ended the season like what Patrick thought, but they had this amazing start to the season. And it's like, well, if you win 10 games that you're not supposed to, it doesn't matter if you then regress to your actual thing. You've got those 10 wins in the book. So, if the Bucks have, a 20-21 game win streak to start the season, even if they regress, and by the way, a regression to me would be like a 60% win team as opposed to a 70% win team. Because don't forget, they did win 60 games last season. So it's like, if they regress to a 60% win team for the remainder of the season, they'll still easily win the East, probably win the NBA. So I think Giannis, it's going to be hard to unseat Giannis, but I could see, I'm going to stand by it. Top 4 seed, 50 plus wins. If that happens, Doncic wins MVP. I'm going to stand by that prediction.
Yeah, and I like your method for figuring that out. But I still say that the best player should always win regardless of the team's record. I don't like players getting punished for being on bad teams, and I don't believe in hollow stats. Really, you just have to look at the right stats. That being said, I agree with what you said. I want to take back what I just said, too. The Mavericks are actually getting unlucky. Even though they're 17-8, their Pythagorean is 19-6. So they're a little bit better than I thought they were.
Awesome. I was going to throw one thing out I've thrown out before, Brian, and I think you agree with me, but I'll just put it out there again. I think the NBA should really, really, really just copy baseball and do an award for each conference because, baseball does that for both leagues, for the American and National League. I think if you just have an Eastern Conference MVP and a Western Conference MVP, Giannis is the Eastern Conference MVP, Doncic is the Western Conference MVP, Doncic or LeBron James is the Western Conference MVP, we're all happy.
Yeah, in baseball, the two leagues didn't used to play each other, but they do now, so it's like, yeah, the NBA could do it too.
Didn't they used to play each other? It was like they'd play for the title, but you're saying they didn't have any inter-conference games regular season?
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the main reasons to have two different MVPs, right? Because there's no way to know, other than the top two teams, who is the best. But now they all play each other all season, right?
It is fascinating when you go over things and realize that they're done because of tradition. And then when you look up their tradition, you're like, that doesn't apply anymore. I just mentioning voting and like the Electoral College in the United States, which, by the way, I'll get on my soapbox for 2 seconds before getting off and we'll talk the Nuggets and the Warriors, Brian, but like is far more racist than you think. And it's built in. Like I get very frustrated in the modern United States arguing about racism and going, you can go back in time to the Civil War, to the Revolutionary War, and look at what the leaders at the time were saying. And they were very explicitly saying, the reason I'm arguing this is because of slavery. In fact, we were talking Thomas Jefferson. One of the sad parts about Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams is essentially John Adams was the rumor they were using about him to get him not elected was that he was a warmonger, that he wanted to go to war with France. But he signed the sedition treaty where he was basically saying if you spoke ill of the president, you go to jail. So you had basically John Adams, this anti-free speech person in power that wanted like absolute control for the presidency versus Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson was arguing pro-slavery. So another funny part of United States history is there's a lot of times you don't have a clear-cut good guy. You're like, which worst thing am I fighting for? And just to that point about like outdated systems, and I said the Electoral College, like the Electoral College was built with a lot of racism in it, and a lot of the United States history, like very much like you were saying, the National League MVP versus American League MVP, it's built that way because of things that no longer exist but are kept around because of tradition. And when you look up those traditions, sometimes it's worth going, maybe you don't want to keep this tradition around. Although the AL and NL, I think that one's fine. That one you can keep.
No, it's fair to say we're not going that far at the comparison. But yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of ridiculous that, and a failure of our media and other elites that we don't consider that when, we're taught that in school, right? when you're a young kid. We got the Constitution came around because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, and that's how we got the Electoral College, and it was all about slavery. Like, we're literally taught that, but we somehow forget it, later in life. I don't know. So, yeah, we need a civic surge of some kind in the United States right now.
The metaphor I'd give to that is it's very much the headline problem we see with clickbaity articles, where even if an article is perfectly written and explains everything in depth, when you get the headline like, person completely destroys so-and-so an argument, and you watch it like, that's not what happened at all. To go back to a chess one, this was hilarious. There was a YouTube video I saw for Vishy Anand. I'm going to label him my favorite chess champion.
Nice.
Right? Because one, he's did it when he was super old and is still competing at a top level at 50. He is 50 years old and he is still ranked top 10. I think top 5. I think he's still ranked top 5.
Yeah, Kasparov quit when he was 41, for instance.
So yeah,
42, something like that. Yeah.
Freaking amazing chess player, and I kind of look like him. So I give those are 2 reasons.
Nice.
So I kind of look like him, and he's amazing at an old age.
So he's Indian, right, Trey? I don't know if you have any Indian heritage.
I absolutely zero as far as I. But we were talking that too, where he was probably huge for chess, and that chess is huge in India thanks to him, which just a huge market. But all I was going to say is there was a clickbaity video I saw once of watch Vishy Anand, get really upset with a reporter, and it was someone asked him, they were like, "What do you mean play your best?" And he said something like, "What do you mean? What do I mean play my best? I said it. Can you not hear?" That was said. That was the back and forth. And they're like, "Look at Vishy Anand, go nuts on this report." It's like, no. And so when you talk about United States history, I think a lot of that's it. We get these clickbaity headlines like "Founding Fathers Fight for Freedom." And when you look it up, it's really like rich Southerners don't want to pay higher taxes. So, finagle the Constitution to kind of allow some freedom for some people, maybe kind of. But that's not the headline, right? The headline is "Founding Fathers Fight for Freedom" is what it is.
Yeah, last thing I'll say on the Founding Fathers is they were self-interested like everyone else is. So once you realize that, it all makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think the United States, much like sports, we have a tendency to glamorize and lionize our former greats, and I think this is something that's hard in sports too, right? People like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, they get these auras around them that people just want to believe that they're perfect, and when you dig into them, they weren't. And so I think it's a very hard image for modern athletes to live up to, an image that isn't real. And so I think if collectively we accept these people were good at these things, but they were not perfect, which does not mean they're great, which means when we're judging current people, we shouldn't have this false expectation of stuff. I'll give a preemptive shout out to the Cracked podcast. 2 podcasts ago, Adam Todd Brown was a guest, and they talked about former United States elections that prove that modern elections aren't anything special. Basically meaning all of this stuff that really offends us, we're like, oh my God, decorum is gone in elections. It has pretty much been there the entire United States history. As a comparison, don't forget Donald Trump was bashing John McCain as a war hero. Thomas Jefferson went after George Washington, the war hero. Thomas Jefferson fled from Monticello in the Revolutionary War. So he didn't fight in the Revolutionary War, and yet in his elections he was bashing George Washington as being unpatriotic. So this thing of draft dodger insulting war hero, that's been there since the 3rd United States election. It's nothing new. And so that's the only other thing. Yeah, for both sports and United States history, if you go back in time and look, you're like, oh, these people weren't perfect. So when we're looking at Kevin Durant, let's actually use that as an excuse to go into Kevin Durant. Let's talk your Warriors a little, Brian.
Sure.
Kevin Durant's obviously a very polarizing character to the Warriors. And something that just happened today that I brought up is there are 2 things we're going to talk Kevin Durant today. The first is the Golden State Warriors Twitter account released a Team of the Decade. I think they were named Team of the Decade by ESPN. And they released a slideshow of all these great moments of the Warriors. Steph Curry holding up the MVP, winning a title. And an astute viewer would notice, and someone, I forget who I noticed on Twitter, but if you go to my Twitter account, Nerd Numbers, I retweeted the person. An astute viewer noticed there are no pictures of Kevin Durant, even group photos, right? There is no picture where you can clearly see Kevin Durant's face naming the Warriors the team of the decade. And they said something like Kevin Durant, 2-time finals MVP, get out of here with him not being excluded from the celebration. So that exact same thing, right? Kevin Durant, people are going like, he wasn't loyal like Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan. And if you go back in time, had there been social media in Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant's era to the degree it is now, I mean, rest assured, like there would have been a Kobe Bryant burner account or Michael Jordan burner account, something like that. We would have seen some bullshit like that happen.
Yeah, and I hate to get back to Chris Ye again, or maybe I don't, maybe I want to, but this is the alliance kind of stuff, right? Like the Warriors and Kevin Durant should have figured out a year ago that he was going to leave, and just both sides should have gone about their business like that was true. Instead, there's all this posturing and bullshit that ended up in the situation we're in now. Like, just be real about what's going to happen. That's all. Like, that's a much better way to do business, I think.
And a high level, so 2 books by a friend of the show, he's been on many times, Chris Ye. He's written 2 New York Times best-selling books with Reid Hoffman, and then Ben Casnocha was a co-author on the first one called The Alliance. So the Alliance premise is, if you look at the modern workspace, there really is not such a thing as job loyalty or lifetime people or long-term career people. So when you hire someone, it is more important to be upfront and try and determine an alliance, that's why they named the book that, between the worker and the employer that says, what am I, the worker, going to get from you, the employer? The employer, what am I going to get from you, the worker? And give a very concrete timeline. And so this feels perfectly applicable to the NBA to go, look I have you for a 3-year contract. At the end of that 3 years, what do I want to have you have done for me, the player, right? I want you to have, made, if we go complete Moneyball, right? I want you to have made this many baskets and this many rebounds and whatever and won this many games. Or, I expect you to have become a starter. And, the Alliance talks about this too, about like founding mindset of saying, or I forget, it wasn't founding, I forget the term they use, but basically you can also have the mindset of, this person we do want to be a CEO or C-level, so not CEO, but C-level person at the company. So we do want them at the end of their 3 years or 5 years or whatever they call it, terms of duty in the book, to be more ingrained in the company. We have that planned out from the outset. But you could also say, you're only going to be here 2 years, but in that 2 years, we think you could do this. That's what the Alliance says. And so we think that would be huge for NBA teams to go for. The other book that we've talked at length is called Blitzscaling, which has more to do with like drafting and acquiring players. But we think teams should go after this. Yeah, the exact point on the Alliance, teams should be aware of, I have this player for a limited period of time. What do I expect at the end of it? And all I can say about the Warriors, though, even on that, is like, if you told me 3 finals and 2 finals MVPs off of a 4-year or a 3-year contract with a player, I'd be like, I would be ecstatic. And so this bullshit pettiness at the end of it is kind of frustrating.
Yeah, that's right. And another place, I was talking to someone about this recently, I don't know if it was you or on the show, but about drafting players. So there's always been this mindset that you don't want to draft older players or seniors in college, guys that are 21 to 23 years of age, because they've hit their ceiling of potential already, and that's bad. That's not what you want, because they're going to be on your team for 10 years or something like that, so you want to maximize that. And we think, according to these alliance rules, that's just the wrong mindset. That, for first of all, just draft the best player, whether they're old or young. But older players can even have some advantages, because really players' primes, we know this based on the age curve, is 25 to 30. So if you draft a guy that's 23, you're going to have him on his rookie deal, which is a cheap, very team-friendly deal, when he's playing in his prime. Whereas with younger players, they're going to exit their rookie deal still really young and undeveloped. Maybe you'll be able to retain them, maybe not, and it's just a crapshoot. So really you should draft players for their rookie deal and how they're going to play under that. Older players are great for that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we suggest both blitzscaling and the Alliance is those 2 points. Teams don't seem to understand the logic of players to draft for and acquire. So one of the key premises of blitzscaling is, in winner-take-all markets, it is okay to lose efficiency if it means you get an advantage. An advantage could be like first to market, first product, market share, et cetera. And so an example we bring up in the NBA is a player like Anthony Davis. I absolutely think the Lakers did not get the optimal trade for Anthony Davis. We, for instance, said it would have been much better for them to trade Kyle Kuzma versus Josh Hart. That being said, if you are negotiating with the Pelicans and they say, you know what? Yes. At the moment they say yes to giving up Anthony Davis, provided you're not giving up LeBron James, that would be the only player on the table. For most teams, I could say, if you're trading for a star, you have a few players that maybe are untouchable, or if they're touchable, it has to be for like multiple. So as an example, the Warriors in their prime, there might have been a point where I'm like, you cannot give up this player unless we get Curry and Draymond, or Curry and Iguodala, or Curry and KD, right? Like, these players are off limits unless it's a twofer. But you could have players that you go, as long as these players stay on my team. For the Nuggets, as an example, Nikola Jokic is one of these. There are players that I would trade the rest of the Nuggets roster for. I'd feel a little bad, but like if you gave me Anthony Davis for the rest of the Nuggets, I'd be like, fine, we win, game over, right? And so when the minute the Lakers got Anthony Davis, it's like, just say yes. It's not an optimal trade, but it's a winning trade, which that's what blitzscaling says. And we see a lot of teams. The Warriors, I don't know how true this is, Brian. Did you hear this rumor that they were debating not offering Steph Curry just a max deal, it's up for renegotiation? And it's like, no, you do not argue with Steph Curry and risk pissing him off and losing him. Just give him the max, except that you maybe lost $3 to $4 million a season, which, amounts to like 20 million, and move on with your day. That's all you do there.
Yeah, and who knows why that story came out? Was it, the team leaking it so that maybe they could get an advantage in the Curry negotiations? Probably not. Was it Curry leaking it to say, look, you better pay me? I mean, I don't understand why this kind of stuff gets out, but it didn't matter in the end. They did pay him rightly, so at least that worked out. We're going to talk about the Warriors soon, but that's one thing they did right.
Well, we're talking about the Warriors right now. And I was going to say, that was my first point, is like, Warriors, don't be petty about stuff like this. If a player contributes greatly to you, this is something we see teams mess up on. For instance, Horace Grant should be retired by the Bulls. These weird contentious relationships that happen in sports because players leave, because there is no loyalty on either side, are ridiculous. And when you have a player as great as Kevin Durant to play for you, he had some off the court issues, but in respect to other off the court issues we've seen in the NBA, it is so far down that it's not something I would ever cut ties with a player over.
Yeah, I mean, I think their rationale must be KD is being petty, so we're going to be petty too. And hey, come on, whatever happened to turn the other cheek?
I think like I said, my litmus test is, if I had a player for my team and that player contributed wholeheartedly to winning a title, so just a title, one singular, their jersey gets retired. So for instance, if I was in charge of the Raptors, Kawhi, as soon as he's eligible, his jersey goes in the Raptor, obviously next to Kyle Lowry, who probably retires first, but who knows, right? Like when I heard the same thing, like Chris Bosh for Miami, I was like, absolutely. I have a topic to get back to with the Nuggets, but let's finish up the Warriors first. So Brian, I'm going to let you talk about this Strauss thing, because it's when we talk petty weird stuff where on the one end I'm like, Warriors don't be. On the other hand, this stuff gets so silly. I'm like, maybe they should be petty. I don't know.
No, just that he said on Ryan Russillo's podcast recently that basically the players were so worried about his feud with Kevin Durant for asking him about when he was going to leave last season in a press conference that they asked Strauss to go to Kevin Durant and apologize for those questions, and of course he didn't. And it's just kind of ridiculous. Like, I don't know what, I mean, again, it's all decided at this point, we think, right? That he decided a year before that he was going to leave. So what's the point? Maybe those players who asked him didn't know, but this just gets back to the alliance again. Like, this kind of stuff is not how you want to run a business. You want to be upfront and honest and not let this bullshit happen. So, yeah, an outside reporter, he's got nothing to do with the team really in the end, right? So it's ridiculous.
So basically, around February, the stories that Kevin Durant was headed to New York were kind of becoming a foregone conclusion. You're saying Ethan Strauss, because he was a beat writer, either was a beat writer, has been a beat writer for the Warriors, now works for The Athletic. asked Kevin Durant about this. Kevin Durant did get upset and said, like, the media was spinning stuff. I was watching a clip before the show of him doing that. And so the players were basically going, Kevin Durant is upset about these line of questionings, take it back. And then, of course, he left. And it does get into all sorts of silliness where, like, you're asking Ethan to apologize for asking about one of the most important stories in sports that ended up being true. Now, then their argument might be, you made that story true, but then that gets silly, right? If you're going, by bugging Kevin Durant about if he was leaving, he got so upset that he left. You're like, well, very, very what's the tail wagging the dog kind of scenario there?
Yeah. I'm not saying Kevin Durant's an abuser, but this is an abuser technique, right? Like, you made me do this to you. Like, come on, that's just bogus.
Well, and we've talked a lot about that, where we're upset with Greg Popovich for how he treats reporters, because that's their freaking job. And it's like, if you're one of the biggest names in the NBA that has not re-signed with your team, that is going into free agency, and don't forget, it's not like this was happening in a vacuum. I don't know if you recall this. The New York Knicks, when the Warriors came through, were trying to sell season tickets. And so they said, the Warriors are coming through tonight. You can buy season tickets. And they had a graphic, and their graphic had Kevin Durant in a Warriors jersey, but on the graphic that they were sending out. So they were trying to send out season ticket advance, for next season, using Kevin Durant's image because they were playing the Warriors that night. Like, everybody was going after Kevin Durant. This was one of the most, who knows, it would be a fun scenario to go over Adrian Wojnarowski's Twitter and see how much he was talking about it too, right? So it's like, it's a little ridiculous to get upset at a reporter for saying that. And I have no outs. We were talking a little Kevin Durant earlier, certainly not to the degree of Bobby Fischer, not even close, but it is interesting where, the burner accounts that he's had, some of his off-court stuff, it is interesting, that's the best way I'll put it, to watch someone who is the best of the best at their craft and how other stuff can rankle them. And I don't, it's interesting psychological insight. And I don't have anything beyond that. I have no solutions. I don't even have any judgments. It's just like, it is a fascinating real world case study to watch this stuff happen.
Well, okay, so the solution is to not have, the mandatory media availability that these players, have to go out there and talk to these reporters when they don't want to. That's not realistic, of course, because the league really wants to expose all the players. But we've talked about this tension before, right? The players play basketball. That's mostly all they do. Some of them are amazing and can do other stuff, like Victor Oladipo is apparently kicking ass on The Masked Singer and is a great singer. But
really?
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly what's happened there, but that's something people are talking about. But in general, these guys are really focused on basketball, right? So, yeah, there's going to be confrontations with the media. And then it's also kind of just a hierarchical thing, right? If you're the player and the star, you're one of the top people in the organization, and the media people are farther down. So if you're having a bad day, you can kind of just punch down on them with no repercussions. So I don't know. And at the same time, it is antagonistic, right? A good journalist is not just going to kiss the player's ass. They're going to try to, dig in there and find stuff out. And, if I was in that position, I had the media coming after me for some reason, it's probably not going to happen. I'm pretty boring, but I don't know how I'd react. Maybe I wouldn't like the media either. So I can sympathize, but at the same time, I think the dynamic is pretty straightforward.
It's one of these, just like, the entire situation is ridiculous, and I'm more inclined to lean towards Ethan's side in this case, which is going, the reporter asking a question about one of the biggest stories in the NBA seems like a no duh. And don't forget, I actually recall this. We were apologies. My cat really wants to get in on the podcast. So say hi, Miha. Miha's going to get in the action. All right. So we were talking about Kevin Durant actually made a quote last season when Anthony Davis's name was everywhere. And he was like, of course we talk about it. Why wouldn't you talk about it? He's one of the biggest names in sports. So it's like Kevin Durant talking about other big name free agent movements is like, of course, why wouldn't you talk about it? Then they're like, well, what about you? Where are you planning on going? He's like, hey, you should apologize for that. So it's,
I forgot about that.
I love Kevin Durant as a player. He is one of the best my cat would like to get in. So say hi, Miha. He is one of the best basketball players ever, one of the greatest scorers ever. But this is a little ridiculous.
Yeah, that's right. So are we ready to talk about my thing on the Warriors? Because this is annoying me.
Yes, please. And obvious, my cat and my FaceTime are all deciding to go against me, so I'll let you talk. Apologies for that background noise. I'm going to try and mute myself.
All right, so there's a story today. Let's go in here. Oh no, that's the wrong story. Okay, I'll just talk about that and not bring up the story. So the Warriors are doing really poorly this year, right? They've been going between kind of like 27th and 30th in the league, one of the worst teams. They got blown up by the Knicks recently. It's no secret why, right? They shipped out not just Kevin Durant, but all their other talent, including Iguodala. And then on top of that, they had a million injuries, right? So we know that's a recipe for a really, really bad team. And so they're just kind of tanking this year. They're calling it a gap year, which is kind of funny. So first of all, in the gap year, I'm kind of against that because we're going to talk about two different Patrick principles right here. Patrick Minton says some smart things on this show over the years and written on boxscoregeeks.com. This one is the ladder to success. And we talk about this in context of tanking, where teams tend to think, the process and all that. If I go down and tank for a couple years, get all these good draft picks or whatever young players, we're just going to shoot all the way up to the top, like on an elevator. We're going to take it from the bottom league up to the top. But then when you look at how it actually goes in the history of the NBA, it doesn't ever work like that, right? It's more like climbing a ladder. So you can be a team like the Rockets, and you're kind of a mediocre, maybe playoff team. Then all of a sudden you get James Harden and a couple of other good players, Chris Paul. You're ready to fight for a title. So they just climb that ladder. The Rockets were not the worst team in the league before they made their run, right? To be honest, the Warriors did the same thing. Drafted Steph Curry, drafted Draymond Green, Draymond and Klay Thompson. And they were kind of a mediocre playoff team, got their ass kicked by the Clippers, but then they brought in Bogut and Iguodala, and they climbed those last few rungs of the ladder and got to the top, right? So what they're doing this year by dismantling the whole team seems crazy to me. I don't know if they're going to be able to hop in that elevator and get back up to the top like everyone thinks they are. They're really far down in talent, even with Steph Curry and Draymond Green still on, under control. So yeah, I'm suspicious they have a lot of work to do before they can get back to the playoffs, considering just how bad they are right now. And we know that because we can look at the numbers, right? We can look at their O rating, we can look at their D rating, we can look at their point margin. We can just watch them play. They're just bad, bad, bad. So how are they going to get back there? Well, what did they do with Kevin Durant? They made the sign and trade with the Nets for D'Angelo Russell, giving him a max deal. He's only 28 years old. He's an exciting player. He was an all-star. He played like an all-star earlier in the season last year, kind of fell off. We didn't think he was a real all-star. Not playing great this year. He's been hurt a little. He did have a few really good games, though. So that potential is there, right? Maybe by the time he's 25 in 2 seasons, he will be a real all-star. But in the meantime, he has this ridiculous contract that he's not living up to. And when you're the Warriors and you have Steph Curry, who's now in his early 30s, you can't wait 2 years. You have to try to win a title every year. So I was not a fan of that trade. But there is a rumor, maybe he's never going to be long-term on the team. He's there as a trade asset because his value is still considered to be high. It's now December 16th. They could now trade him to another team if they wanted. So the story today was they don't plan on trading him until the offseason. They're just going to keep him all year. And so this came from Zach Lowe and one of the other ESPN guys on a podcast. Forgive me, maybe Mark Stein. Is he still ESPN? I don't know. Anyway, the point is their rationale is saying, okay, the Warriors are such a bad team, they're going to get the first pick overall maybe. They could package him with D'Angelo Russell, make a serious run at somebody, maybe Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid, who aren't going to be happy potentially because the 76ers in the future maybe won't be as good. But you see what I'm getting at? It's so convoluted, right? Like, why do you have to go through all these hoops, lose another whole season this year, and just go through with it when you have all these big guys you have, which is the Warriors' weakness right now, right? They're paying all this money for guards. You have potentially Andre Drummond available, Kevin Love, maybe even Steven Adams, who's under contract for a few years, is only 26, is already playing like a top center. So they have all these opportunities right now to prove that dream.
I think you said Kevin Love.
Yeah, Kevin Love is supposed to be available right now. Yeah.
But he's not 26, right? He's got to be way older.
No, he's 31, but Steven Adams is 26.
Ooh, interesting. Okay, so I missed. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so those are just three guys off the top of my head. All-star, bigs capable of being top 10 caliber players. Maybe not Kevin Love anymore. Maybe he's too old. But the point is, you could trade Russell. Russell's considered to have a really good trade value, and you could trade him right now for someone much better than he actually is, and get arbitrage in a deal. Right? You can get arbitrage right now for D'Angelo Russell. Next offseason, maybe, but we don't know. So then this is the second Patrick point. And I think you mentioned this earlier in the show, the Picasso principle, right? If you have something right now, you have to do it. You can't wait a year or two for some convoluted deal. So I don't know why the Warriors want to keep staying bad. They just need to improve their roster now. Sorry, D'Angelo Russell. Seemed like a nice guy, but you just don't fit on the team with Steph Curry here.
There are two high-level things about all of that. The first I'll say has to have been utterly frustrating for you as a Warrior, which is when you're talking about like building a team and staying successful, all of the decent players that they've just let walk or not gone after. JaVale McGee, Danielle, is it Danielle or House plays for the Rockets now?
Daniel House Jr., yeah. In all fairness, he didn't get much action with the Warriors, so I can't say like they should have known he was going to be good.
But okay,
they did let him go.
Daniel House Jr. got no time for the Warriors. JaVale McGee got let go. Andre Iguodala, they just basically traded for cap exchange. Jordan Bell, a player that they let out the door. It's like the Warriors have not done anything beyond this core of great players that they had. Curry, Draymond, Clay, and Durant, and then of course between those four, they arguably let the best go. They let Kevin Durant, it might not have been their choice, but Kevin Durant goes. So they shouldn't have kept Klay Thompson even before the injury, after the injury, even more egregious. And if you're going to lose Kevin Durant, you don't want to lose him for D'Angelo Russell. That's exactly what you're saying. Like there had to have been, even on the Nets, right? I think the Nets, who are actually playing decently, had some better assets than I think they could have gone after.
No, they could have gotten Joe Harris and probably Jared Allen. Like if they'd done that, I would have been ecstatic.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean they ended up right. So the big names that the Nets got this season, although they're not going to get to really enjoy them, Kyrie, DeAndre, Kevin Durant, right? And we've had injuries to all three, but there were definitely some good. You said Joe Harris and Jared Allen would have been good. I'm trying to see if there's anybody else I really like on that team. And I'll have to look more in depth, but that wasn't the best trade they could have gotten for Kevin Durant. And then they just have not been doing enough maintenance on the team overall, which is really, really the frustrating part.
Well, it's more than that. It's not negligence. They're intentionally dismantling the team. So it feels like a tanking sort of move to me.
That's what you're saying this season. And I'm saying leading into the season, that was the egregious flaw, right? It was not keeping players like JaVale McGee. It was not keeping Jordan Bell and Andre Iguodala this offseason that led them to the position they're in now, which is a couple of their big names, Steph Curry, D'Angelo Russell, get injured. Draymond Green's been going through injuries too.
Yep.
I think they should tank. The second bigger issue, which is just frustrating, is misaligned incentives that also teams aren't good at evaluating. The Warriors are really, really, really far out of the playoffs right now, right? They are worst in the NBA with a 5-23 record. Right now, a losing record gets you into the playoffs out west. That's very hard to see, odd. But Oklahoma City with 11-14 is the 8th seed. They are still many, many games away from that. So they probably have no shot of making the playoffs. So I know you're talking about like, why don't you trade D'Angelo Russell now? I agree. The problem is the only incentive that exists in the NBA at this point is for them to lose games. And while it's not a good incentive or one that when we evaluate makes any sense, it's kind of the only one there. So
yeah,
the issue is they've made bad decisions that have got them to this point, and now the only short-term motivator that exists is tanking. And again, they're saying this weird stuff of like, oh well, what we're gonna do is we'll get a top 4 draft pick probably because that's what happens if they're the worst team in the league. They're guaranteed a top 4 pick. Really low odds of getting a number 1 pick, right? Only
Yep.
four, only 14%.
Which is why the Zach Lowe logic is shit to me. But go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, and this logic of we're gonna package up these picks to get a great deal. I mean, it is kind of just amusing that could be right. Don't forget the well, actually, right, the Pelicans did that. They got a number 1 pick and they packaged up Anthony Davis out and they didn't get anything in return. I'm doing this the wrong way though. It's interesting that they think that they're going to get a good trade, and the reason I would be skeptical is it's not as if this team has made great decisions. I want to be a little mean to your Warriors. I really want to start hammering this home a little heavier. They got notorious for the owner, Lacob, saying that they were light years ahead of the league. When we examine the success of the Warriors, the team of the decade, which we would probably agree with, the key components were completely outside of the decisions of the current ownership. When they bought the team, Steph Curry, thanks to Don Nelson, by the way, Steph Curry and Draymond Green were already there. So they acquired a team that already had these 2 greats. Andre Iguodala and Kevin Durant went out of their way to go on the team to the effect that management of the Warriors has admitted they did not think they had a chance with these players. Bob Myers, we actually, I love his transparency. I actually love Bob Myers being very, aw shucks about it. Andre Iguodala and Kevin Durant should not have been Warriors, right? The Warriors were not the easiest or best destination for those players, but they both ended up there. So this team has succeeded because of Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Andre Iguodala, and Kevin Durant. I would list those players as their top 4. And the current ownership did not make those decisions. Like, admittedly,
I go farther and say they're probably only 4 players that matter. Like, I don't think Clay or any of the other players really mattered as much as those 4. Like, they are such more significant than anyone else.
Clay's contract mattered, but then we kind of argue that might be luck. So who knows? But yeah, so I mean that's the problem is when you're going, okay, well, this team tells us they're going to make a move. They're going to make an active move on their behalf to improve this team. We go, we haven't seen you do this well. We've yet to see you make a smart decision. The last time they tanked, they ended up with Harrison Barnes, and he played like 1 good season and then was never the same, although dude got paid off of it. So
got him a title, their first title too. Barnes is very good on that team. So they do deserve some credit for that.
Barnes was helpful on that team, but it's just, I think it is fine as a Warriors fan to be scared and reluctant because of the position they're in.
Yeah, they just, their decision making just hasn't looked very good, and just their ability to evaluate talent hasn't looked very good. There's been some seasons where they brought in really, really good role players. I would argue last season was one of those. That last season, although they didn't win the title, I'd say was probably their most talented team, but they had a lot of injuries. Other seasons, not so much. You had Mo Spates and guys like that in the rotation that weren't very good. So it just, to me, keeps looking like they think that we have this Warriors mojo and we have chemistry. We can just put anyone in there we want into our system, and our system is going to get it done for us. But in reality, they've had such good players, and now they don't.
The last good piece of news is they are kind of like the Lakers of old, in that they're a Bay Area team. Don't forget, this idea. There are players like LeBron James that want to be entrepreneurs when they retire. So that there are players that would like that market. It's a big market. It's a good market. They've got championship cachet, and they've got some good, they still have Steph Curry on it. So it's not like they have no draw. It's not like this team is dead. And we've said that before. If you look at the cupboard of this team, it's not like this team is bad. Our 100% our concern boils down to us going, we've seen what this management does, and it has not impressed us when they are making active decisions in the past. But we'll leave that as a challenge to you, Warriors ownership. Prove us wrong. Prove us wrong, Warriors. You've done it in the past. In fact, I've bragged about this before, Brian. Jeremy Britton, you and myself have all written stuff about the Warriors' prognostications, and you and Jeremy came out looking like fools, and I'm the one who came out the year before they didn't win the titles and said, there are a lot more cracks on this team, and people that think it's a foregone conclusion they're going to win a title are wrong. And I ended up being right. So, you can prove me wrong this year because I won last year, Warriors. Let's go for the rematch.
Wait, it's last year you're talking about?
Yeah, last year when they signed DeMarcus Cousins, everybody's like, season's over, give it up.
Oh, I see.
I wrote a long article that said, here are a lot of issues, including like contracts, right? I basically said they had some big contracts to deal with. They had some players that were dealing with injury. There were, you never know about the rest of the NBA. So all of that stuff, I was like, people are way too high on the Warriors. And then, they ended up not getting to the finish line 100%, losing in the finals.
Yeah, it was because of injuries for sure, but I'm on board with you for that. The best team is just the favorite, but it's never a guarantee. I mean, yeah, there's no way they should have been. They were ruining the league. That narrative, that was bogus.
Yeah, well, I mean, now we have like a topic we're going to have to dig in more depth if we can get the research on about like falling TV ratings. The Warriors being the team everybody knew for years and then suddenly not being good, I don't think is good for the NBA. I think it makes more sense for the NBA to want to keep good teams and good markets good. But that's a much bigger can of worms that we've talked before, and rest assured we'll talk more. I actually, my team, I want to talk the Nuggets a little, Brian, just because they've been kind of absent, even though they're my team. Here's what's interesting. Nikola Jokic has not looked good. The Nuggets, a lot of the players we've liked have not looked good. Chris Ye off the air was very polite and said, he was thinking about bringing up Jamal Murray's max contract because Jamal Murray, a shooting guard, got a max contract from the Nuggets. And he's a below average player. Now he's like a Derek Fisher player, a Klay Thompson player, a player that's fine, a player that can be in the lineup of a championship squad, but not a player that you want to be giving, 20 to 25% of your salary cap to. So some of these players that, we love on the Nuggets aren't looking great, but the reality is they're a top 4 seed. They lead their division. They're 4-0 in their division, so they have all the tiebreakers required right now. And Nikola Jokic, one of the biggest jokes at the start of the season was he came back looking overweight. He looked like he'd gained 15 pounds. It is a heck of a lot of fun being an out of shape person, Brian, watching people bash, like models and professional athletes. They're like, look at this out of shape guy. And you're like, wow, he's got a little bit of extra weight, but is still in amazing shape and can like probably bench press 200 pounds and run for an hour straight and all this. It's like, people that watch things and judge it are funny. My favorite example I've given is there was a ESPN 30 for 30 on boxing, and these people were saying that Durant against Sugar Ray looked out of shape.
Oh yeah.
And I'm like, you have these like 56-year-old white guys with, bigger guts than me even, that are like saying that this like world championship boxer looks out of shape, and I'm like, there's something weird about that. So yeah, there were these beliefs that Jokic looked out of shape coming back from the offseason. There's been all sorts of rumors in the Nuggets rumor mill about him not being dominant enough, all that. But the reality is the numbers back up that he has not looked good to start the season. But even in spite of that, the Nuggets are doing great. And then the last 2 games Nikola Jokic has had, he had a triple double, and then like 20 point, like 8 assists, 5 assists, 8 rebound game against the Knicks. So it's like, it's a funny one where it's kind of the exact opposite of the Warriors. I'm going, this team, despite all this stuff going wrong, is in great shape, is right. They're a top 4 seed with a winning record. And I only see upside. Whereas like the Warriors, I'm like, oh, you're worst in the league. And I'm not excited about what you're potentially going to do in the future. So the Nuggets are kind of the anti Warriors at this point. Things aren't going great, but things look great for them.
Yeah, and Jokic has looked pretty good lately. It's not just been that one game. He's had a few. And I mean, again, this is why, sample size matters, and we need, now that we're a third of the way or, closer to halfway through the season, things are looking a lot better. For Jokic is playing more like himself, and for instance, Donovan Mitchell is not looking like the MVP anymore. He's fallen all the way back down to being kind of a normal player, which means he would have had to been playing very below average to fall from that MVP level. So, yeah, things are normalizing for all these players.
Yeah, I mean, that is just a common thing we bring up every year is early season. We don't, it's small sample size theater is what we've called it, but like any player in the NBA can have a stretch of 10 games that looks like whatever you want to call it. MVP worthy, worse than the league worthy, right? James Harden, I was looking him up. Haven't done like box scores of the year this year, but like James Harden does have one of the best games of the year, if not the best game of the year, and one of the worst games of the year, if not the worst game of the year, right? So like James Harden, both freaking sides of the curve. And same thing, like, yeah, Nikola Jokic. And the other funny thing is, I'm not saying some of these reasons out of shape after an off season, maybe has, other issues. It's one of the reasons why I argue analytics are kind of overrated, which is a funny thing to say as an analytics person. I'm not saying analytics don't matter, but the way I see people use analytics in front offices, I think they put too much effort into things with minimal return, where
Right.
investing in things like the alliance, investing in smarter coaching, investing in player mental health, right? I think all of these things are smarter routes. And it's funny, like I said, with the Bucks, the funny thing is the Bucks had a ABPR analytics person on staff for like 4 years. And the biggest change when we saw this huge boost in performance, even when we were wrong, was when they got Coach Budenholzer and seemed to start playing smarter schemes. And maybe there was synergy between the analytics and the coaching there. But even as the math guy myself that says, hey, math guys that are really good at numbers and stuff can help out your team, I do think that other methods of getting that across to your players is something that teams do not invest enough in at this moment.
Yeah, you're probably right. And it could even be simpler than that, right? Maybe it's just Giannis getting into his prime versus being a super young player is what really did it. So, yeah, no, I'm with you. And I think that's part of the reason why we get in fights with the, quote unquote analytics community all the time is it feels like we're talking about different questions than them quite a bit. So we've spent most of the show talking about basically Moneyball type stuff, right? Teams construction, where should you put that money? Whereas I feel like they spend more time talking about kind of in-game coaching related stuff, right? Like who should be taking shots from what places on the floor and things like that. And so we're just kind of talking past each other. At least that's how I see it a lot of the time.
Yeah, and what's funny though, a series I've been meaning to write for a while that I may get to one of these days is called like Things People Missed in Moneyball. And an interesting part about Moneyball is that they had a top-down approach. The owner was former military, and so they basically got the general manager, the coaching, and the minor league farm system all on board with, say, this
Right.
notion of you didn't get to bat for the Oakland A's if you didn't know how to take walks. So everybody was on board. And I think, when people list the Moneyball story, they list these high level things and they leave out all these details that are important to it. I'm going to finish this with a Richard Feynman comparable and get us into shout outs. So one of my favorite authors is Richard Feynman. And at the end of one of his books, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, he talks about this term that has gotten popularized and used. He calls it cargo cult scientists. And what he brings up is probably slightly racist, but he brings up this story of like during World War II, this village that was getting supplies from the Allies and that they had made airfields. And so these people wanted to get the supplies after the war ended. So they made their own airfields, but they didn't realize that they were just copying, right? They were making what they thought was an airfield without realizing what actually has to happen to get an airplane there. And he called it cargo cult. And then what he was bringing up was in science, he saw a lot of people learning science where they were just copying things they saw in textbooks or that their teacher told them without actually learning the underlying thought process that was required to do good science. Richard Feynman was very critical of scientific education in both North America and other places. And that's, I think, what is key is when you see people just copying what other people are doing without understanding the underlying things or digging into it. And so the last thing he did is he brought up this rat experiment. He goes over this experiment where this experimenter checks all these variables for how a rat is solving a maze. And so this researcher one by one eliminates the variables. Is it the floor? Is it the smell? Is it yada, yada, yada? Great paper. And then he says people saw that paper and then the future paper, they don't replicate all of those steps. They just take the conclusion from that paper and go on. And that's one of the big problems. So when people recount Moneyball, they look at these, math geeks win, right? Without looking at all these underlying details, such as you have to get everybody in your organization on board. And if you can't do that, it's really hard to bring math into your organization and have it effectively work, right? And then they also, like, other stories that were missed in Moneyball was like there was dissension among the players. Michael Lewis got to follow around the Oakland A's, so he wasn't just talking to Billy Beane. He was talking to other coaches and other players who were talking about this. And like one of the things Moneyball said was, you're not supposed to steal bases, right? If you're not above a certain level, you're not supposed to steal bases. And so there were players on the Oakland A's who were just really bummed out. They're like, this kid is so fast. Why won't he let him steal? And it's so like, that's another crack in the piece of like Moneyball is there's this belief of you get these smart analytics nerds, they bring in the math and they win, and it leaves out one. You got to be on, everybody's got to be on board top to bottom. And even if you have all of the management on board top to bottom, you might have little cracks of dissension along the way. So when you're trying to think about how to use analytics to take over an NBA squad, these things that people miss in the stories that have been glamorized and turned into movies, I feel are important and are left out too much.
Yeah, and our favorite Moneyball story, of course, is Jason Giambi leaving the A's to go to the Yankees. They couldn't afford to pay him, so they got Scott Hatteberg and some other players, and they cobbled together the stats of Jason Giambi for less money with multiple players, right? That's a really interesting concept, and we talk about over and over and over again, right? But what actually happened in history there, though? The A's haven't won a title under the Moneyball era, and the Yankees have. So there you go. Like, the Yankees still just win.
Well, and that's interesting where you say that. And then I'd say the bigger part of that is, right, they cobble together this player, and in the Moneyball movie and book, at one point during the season, Billy Beane gets upset when they're on a losing streak and trades away all these players and later admits it probably doesn't matter. And I would actually, that exact thing you said, I would really like to go look at those players and see how much it matters, because
good point.
It might be the case that, yeah, Scott Hatteberg was pretty good, but he might, baseball's a weird sport too, where they might have lucked out. It's like, yeah, there are these top level feel good stories we like telling ourselves, and there are these dirty details that make the system much more complicated that we like forgetting a lot.
Yeah, the A's did the best with what they had, but it just wasn't close to enough still. We know that now.
Oh, maybe. I mean, if you're a major league ball system that's gone to the playoffs multiple times, I think you're doing fine. That's another weird thing that sports really messes up the perspective of, right? If you're a company that is making money year after year, you're like, that's wow, I'm successful. And if you're a baseball team that's going to the playoffs once every couple of seasons, you're doing pretty good. But then we're like, you didn't win a title, so. Anyway, it's funny stuff. Anyway, Brian, I'll let you wrap up with whatever you want to end the show on. Then I've got one shout out, and that can be it.
No, that's it for me. Let's go to your shout outs.
All right. Only shout out I've got is the Packers have been out of the playoffs for 2 seasons, but thanks to a win against the Bears and a loss by the Rams, the Packers are guaranteed to be in the playoffs. So go Pack, go. Although I will say Aaron Rodgers is not looking amazing this season. So who knows how far they'll go in the playoffs. But key point, unlike chess, all you have to do is make the playoffs and then you got a shot.
There you go.
All right. Well, thanks very much for listening. If you found us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live most Mondays, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/nerd numbers. I'm assuming we'll be off next week for Christmas, Brian. I'm not planning on being in. If you want a podcast, go nuts. And you can catch the podcast version of the show, iTunes and Stitcher, The Box Score Geek Show, as well as live recaps on channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. I've been your host, Ray Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, Brian Foster. You can find on Twitter as Box Score Brian. That's all I got. Go Pack, go, and hope your team regresses to the mean if that's good.